All right, we are going to do this. 1, 2, 3. Just want to get a little, make sure I can sync this up because I realize my camera has the shittiest inbuilt mic. It's not even worth it. Okay, because I am bad at planning, first video of Midori Days is going to be talking about some goddamn books. Before anything else, we're going to eliminate a few books. Mushrooms of the Pacific Northwest. Very good book, not much to talk about. Buy it if you are going to be picking mushrooms in the Pacific Northwest. And then these two. These are slightly different. Yeah, just fucking walk right in front of the fucking light thing you set up, you dumb motherfucker. Okay, here we go. We have two things. Call of Cthulhu, another weird story. Call of Cthulhu is actually very short. This is the whole book. A Lovecraft compendium, and Dune. These books are also not going to be talked about because I am probably going to do another video later. I'm looking for something by Howard, and then I think I'm going to do a little combo. But these are some other books. The last couple years, I decided I was going to try to get more into reading. I read a lot as a child. I read throughout high school. I fell off with reading when people didn't force me to, or even, to be honest, when they did force me to in college. Didn't read for a few years after there, and tried to get back into it. I am extremely bad. I found that I am much better at reading in the morning, and because I've been getting up much earlier this last year, I've been better about reading as a byproduct. So we're going to talk about books I've read over the last few years, mostly the last 7-10 months, somewhere in there. First off, we're going to start with two books I've been chipping away at for fucking ever. This one I've given up on ever finishing. This one I basically finished the other day. This first one is Debt, the First 5,000 Years by David Graeber. David Graeber is the guy who coined the phrase, "We are the 99%. He is a political activist. He is also a academic. I don't know if he's a professor. I don't think so. But he is an anthropologist. And this book is bizarre because it's almost like 3 books wrapped up into one. Somewhere in here, there's a very small, insanely well-written anthropological study on the history of money, the history of credit, early economic systems, that is fantastic and a beautiful read. That book is contained in a larger book, which is a very bloated, cumbersome academic text on the same topic, which just has a lot more clutter and a lot more detail than is probably necessary. And that second book is itself wrapped up in a larger book, which is David Graeber kind of being a character in the book, or at least his personality is in the book, and him sharing his thoughts on politics and society. And David Graeber is a fucking asshole. He is the biggest piece of shit. I fucking hate this guy. This book opens with a weird anecdote about him being at a cocktail party and some random lady flippantly not really understanding the concept of debt, so he just kind of privately thinks to himself about what an asshole she is. He doesn't say that mean, but that really captures the tone of how he thinks. He's very smug. He's very condescending. He's very bitchy. I hate him. He's a hateable person. You might agree with his politics, but he is like Jon Stewart, completely devoid of charm. And it is fucking painful. So excellent book for learning about money and some of the ideas that led to its formation. Horrible book if you want to have a connection with the author and are not him. If you're, to be honest, if you're like a hardcore left person, like if you look at the "We Are the 99% things and you're just like, yeah, fuck yeah, that was a great idea. We sure showed that. You might like this, but if you are not entirely in line with his thinking, it's hard to appreciate it as an outsider because he's just so goddamn abrasive. The other book that took me fucking years to read, a Nietzsche compendium, mostly Beyond Good and Evil, Genealogy of Morals, Twilight of the Idols, Antichrist, Ecce Homo. This book was challenging because it's fucking Nietzsche. You probably know Nietzsche primarily from secondary sources interpreting his work and using their ideas in their own production, or from weird little factoids where isolated sections of what he said just float to you over the internet. And weirdly enough, I think that is the actual appropriate way to consume Nietzsche. If you want to get into Nietzsche, what you should actually do is read a bunch of summaries of his ideas from other people. Then you should get a highlighter and you should skim through his work very quickly, highlighting sections that catch your attention, and then go back and read those, because trying to read him cover to cover is insanely painful. Nietzsche was writing, well, one, he's just insanely complicated. He is a fucking genius. He's insanely fucking intelligent, but he was also very wrapped up in his own head. So his thoughts will get so convoluted that it's really hard to understand what he's saying as an outsider. Same issue as here, but in this case it's not outside his politics, it's just outside his mind. Nietzsche is insanely hard to get through. He's just a very complicated person. And he was writing in a historical context that doesn't really exist anymore and is hard to appreciate, where Nietzsche will get into these bizarre fucking tangents where he's talking about something that one specific guy said, where it's like, fucking Hubert Fitzsimmons made a mistake about the transubstantiation of the non-lingual connection to the phenomenological basis for biological substrates. And that was a nonsense phrase that I just said, but it feels like that reading this. He's attacking ideas that did not take root in some cases, or have just kind of phased out of memory. So sometimes it's hard to know what he's even fucking talking about or why he would care in the first place. It feels like very misspent energy. But if you go through here, like I told you, you will find ideas that will stick with you fucking forever. There's a point in here where he just makes the statement that it's obvious that the reasons for an act always come after the act itself, but we never acknowledge this. And that has kind of dominated my fucking thought for the last several months. And it was just a flippant statement he made. And there are plenty of things like that in here. There's a section in Beyond Good and Evil where it's almost like an ancient religious text. It's like the Gospel of Thomas, if you're one of the few people who know what that is, where it's just disconnected sayings, almost written as little religious idioms. And that was my favorite part of the whole book, because it's so digestible, and Nietzsche was being so efficient with his language, which he is in general, but it was one of the rare places in his work where it's just easy to digest what he says. Beyond that, that's all I can really say is, within this book, there are passages that stuck with me and will stay with me for the rest of my life, but there was a lot of it where it was just painful. And I knew a lot about Nietzsche going into this, just because of, like I said, the secondary derivative sources that use him. I have had professors who have told me horror stories about students who went up to them and said, I would like to learn German because I want to study people like Nietzsche and Hegel, and I think German would help with that. And the professor had to tell them, no, don't fucking do it. It's worse. Because the act of translation filtered them down a little bit and made them comprehensible as a byproduct. Trying to read them in the original language, it's even more convoluted somehow, so don't even try. But yeah, that's Nietzsche. Valuable. This is the only book. It's rare for me to feel this way about a book, but I almost feel like I'm not smart enough to get this. I almost get the impression that the only person who can ever really understand Nietzsche is himself. And maybe that's the point on some level, but either way, not an efficient way to get into the true meaning of his work, but what I found was very valuable. Very different. Mere Christianity by C.S. Lewis. I was aware of C.S. Lewis. I had been exposed to some of his thinking before, just disconnected quotes. I was aware of the Narnia series. I picked this up on a whim, and it was a very good book. Lewis is not the unrestrained, world-shattering genius that Nietzsche is, but he's a very clever man, and really my kind of guy. I almost feel like I can use C.S. Lewis as a benchmark to explain myself to other people. I've actually, we'll get there when we get to McKenna, but I've kind of gotten the habit of telling people, and by people I mean the imaginary apparitions I talk to while I'm wandering around in a fucking haze because I'm a fragmented shell of a human. As I've gotten in the habit of telling people, if you want to understand me, just know that two of my favorite thinkers are C.S. Lewis and Terence McKenna. And if you can find a way to reconcile the insanity of those two pairs, you probably understand who I am on some level. C.S. Lewis, much of this is a compilation of material that he gave during World War II. He gave speeches to embolden the British troops, the Allied troops, and all that. Back then, they could be a little more explicitly religious, and I guess England is officially a Christian nation, just not in a practice at this point, for the most part. This was his attempt to condense the soul of Christianity, you could say, and the aspects of the religion which did not apply to other religions, and kind of define it. It contains a bunch of just little nuggets of wisdom, insights he has about the world, what he views as Christian morality on a variety of topics, what he thinks are the underpinnings of Christian thought, which make it unique from other people. Reading this book, I had kind of a moment of clarity, where there's a passage in here where, I guess just to give some background, I have changed mentally immensely in the last few years. I'm a person who changes pretty fast in general. My life and thinking at one stage often bear very little resemblance to at another stage, but in these last few years, I've underwent insane alterations in my perception of the world. And this was one of the first instances of me feeling kind of a unity and a symbiosis with another thinker, which was a big moment for me. There's a part in here, fucking fridge. I have a thing with fridges, son of a bitch. Yeah, okay, sorry. There's a passage in this book where Lewis actually says that it can be hard for Christians to communicate with their non-Christian countrymen because it can be just alien to try to communicate their morality. And since I've underwent this change, I've had many experiences where I've just been confusing to other people, where I will get hysterically mad at someone for not showing appropriate compassion to someone who is like objectively a scourge to society. But then I'll be weirdly calm about like the actual damage done by something. And there's a part in here where he basically says Christians can be weirdly obscure to non-Christians because a Christian might hear about a murder and shrug it off as an unfortunate incident, but an error in thinking or a bad attitude might elicit just rage towards the person who, uttered the misstatement. And that was a kind of a moment of introspection where I looked at myself and was like, oh, okay, my bizarre moral tangents and spiritual development has kind of taken me full circle, where I now have more in common with traditional moralities, which I used to scoff at, than the, technocratic, dry, rationalistic morality, which I used to be very entrenched in, and which most of the people I know still are. Not that much I can say about it beyond that. Not for everyone, obviously, but if you have an interest in that kind of thing, definitely very good for what it was. On a similar note, The Righteous Mind by Jonathan Haidt. This book was fucking fantastic. This is one of my favorite books of all time. This was incredible. Jonathan Haidt, if you don't know, he's popped up on a few sources. He was on Joe Rogan a few times, talking about how social media is damaging kids. He's a psychologist who is he's kind of an ethnographer of people. He studies cultural differences, the different sources of morality. He gets criticism from other people sometimes where, for example, he has clashed with Sam Harris, who is over here, where Haidt takes a very holistic approach to society. He can be very affectionate towards religion in kind of a disconnected way, just because he views because he studies the effects it has on people, and he sees that it has many pro-social qualities, and he enjoys that. The fact that it doesn't necessarily make sense doesn't really bug him like it would Harris. He's a very pragmatic person in that way. This book is kind of an exploration of morality and, more importantly, why people have different moral sensibilities. To an extent, he gets into personality theory. Openness to experience comes up because how could it not? Kind of the core thesis that drives much of what he says in this is if you do a survey of people's moral underpinnings, you can extract basically 5 factors that guide their thinking. Let's see if I remember this. There's harm reduction, or the avoidance of pain, and fairness and or egalitarian operation. Those 2 are universal to basically all humans. But there are also 3 others that are intermittent but there are 3 others that show up less consistently. Those are purity, authoritarian/respectfulness, and what was the third one? And I remember now. The third is in-group solidarity. And basically his thesis is those first 2, harm reduction and egalitarianness or fairness, are universal to all people, but people that are generally called conservatives have 3 others, and they have a 5-factor morality, and that's part of where the difference between people comes up, where a certain subset of humanity has deemed certain moral sources as outdated and they no longer resonate with them, and a separate group still hold on to all 5. He gets into religion. He gets into religion as a source of social unity and something that promotes a common morality. He gets into conflicts between groups. He gets into the underpinnings of where this might have came from, and that's where it gets a little more interesting. He has a section in here where he gets into group evolution, where organisms were selected for at the group level rather than the individual level. This comes up fairly often in controversial and or edgy scientific literature. It's this kind of weird holy grail where it can explain a lot, but it also has bizarre implications and would undermine much of our existing thinking. And he does get into that here. All in all, it is a very, very clever explanation of different cultures, different values, and it overturns much of what you would think about. And it also, and not in a way that's quaint, it tells you things that you would not expect. Like, basically, he finds that there's a global, emerging, educated class that kind of all have the same morality that's very liberal. But you can go just a few miles from there, and if you get into more traditional people, you find moral sensibilities which are way, way removed from kind of the assumptions that, like, the media and the educational system operate from. Where a surprising portion of the world is still entrenched in very old-fashioned ways of determining whether an action is right or wrong or not. All right. The Undiscovered Self by Jung. same story as Nietzsche. I know a fair amount about Jung from secondary sources, have not really read him directly. Picked this book up on a whim. It has been listed as a very good introduction to Jung if you want to get into him a bit, but don't want the commitment of one of his bigger books, and they get pretty big. This is basically a political tract, oddly enough, where Jung is pushing the idea out there that humanity is at a very interesting place. We need to get a little more introspective. We need to look into the symbols of our morality, question what they actually mean. It's been a while since I read this. If I had to put the thesis simply, it would be that we need to undergo the process of individuation, which is where you look into yourself, confront your dark side, and come up with a more holistic view of yourself, which is also much more independent and capable of, thinking apart from the group and questioning your own decisions. Basically, he's saying we need to do that because we have nuclear weapons, the world is very complicated, and we need to kind of develop into a new, more mature form of humanity that we can do by facing our issues and developing mentally. One thing about this that I was very surprised about, Jung gets into his metaphysics, and he is very tame in that area compared to what I would expect. There's so much talk about symbols and alchemy and the discussion around Jung, but he seems very materialistic in his basic assumptions of the world, which, again, I was not thinking. I thought he'd be much more the psyche is everything and we need to alter our perceptions, but he's fairly grounded in that respect. He talks about Christianity in very pure symbolic terms, where he explicitly tells the audience we need to look at Christianity as a set of symbols and ask what that means for us in terms of our internals and our morality, and that's part of the path forward. The idea of humoring spiritual things is kind of literally true on their own level, never really even comes up. It's very early 1900s in that regard, which seems kind of obvious, but since him and Freud got into shit over spirituality, basically, I was surprised to realize how scientific, and I was just surprised that Jung didn't contrast with Freud more in that area, but we'll put this here. Need a breather, hold on. Okay, 1, 2, 3, slap. Okay, we have Marcus Aurelius, his Meditations. On the off chance you don't know, and you don't all have history degrees, so I should probably assume that. The Roman Empire basically became a proper empire with Julius Caesar, or at least that was the point where the Republic was obviously over. His successor, Augustus, really solidified the empire as a political institution, but there was this lengthy period where people were kind of in denial about the fact that the Republic was over, and there was a lot of instability. There were the Julio-Claudians for a couple generations, but that went to hell. After Nero, they kind of gave up on the idea that the dynasty made sense. There was a long period of chaos. Things eventually settled into a pattern of somewhat stability. And after stability set in, there was eventually a point where life was actually pretty good, and there's the period of what they called the Five Good Emperors, where there was a famous British historian who made the case that this was the best time and place to be a human being at any point in world history, was the Roman Empire under the Five Good Emperors, and by far the most famous and beloved of those Five Good Emperors is Marcus Aurelius. He was a Stoic philosopher, probably the most famous one, honestly. He did not found the movement, that happened hundreds of years earlier, but he was a philosopher who wrote philosophy in his spare time while running an entire civilization. And this is a compilation of his Meditations, which is basically a private journal, which is a work of Stoic philosophy, but also just him jotting down thoughts about his life in his quiet hours as he tucked in the bed. It is a fascinating read, and you really see why people latch on to Marcus Aurelius as a great thinker. He is a very humble man. He's very introspective, very self-critical, very frustrated. He's someone very prone to introspection, asking why things are going wrong. One of the first chapters in this book begins with a passage where, to quote him poorly, he says, "Every day I will wake up, go out, and meet people who are not focused upon the good, who are short-centered, who are short-sighted, who are bad-tempered, who are acting against what is right for foolish reasons. I must remember that they are simply ignorant of the truth, that my countrymen and me are like teeth on the opposite side of the mouth, and that we are both serving the whole, as painful as it may be." This was my first real deep dive into Stoicism, and I have to say, I really get the philosophy. I, again, see why people like it. It almost reminds me of what I know of existentialism in a very indirect way. Aurelius basically portrays life as a very frustrating thing where it's not entirely clear while you're doing it or if you can actually accomplish anything. But basically, you need to just calm down, have some perspective, look at how small you are in the scheme of things, understand that everything is a united whole and there's a larger purpose to all action, or at least we're going to act as if that's true. And in a way, be kind of forgiving of things. Something you come across in like Eastern religions is they often don't have a concept of evil so much as failure or simply ignorance. I'm kind of stealing from Harris there, but you know what I mean. And Aurelius is very much in that camp. He doesn't really see people as evil. He sees them as weaker than himself, and therefore someone he needs to show patience to and kind of help them along. His perspective on life is very much, life is hard, try to do the right thing anyway. People are weak, try to help them out. He sees the world as a very frustrating and often very dark and nihilistic place, but his response is basically assume that there is a purpose to it and just try to perform your role as admirably as you can. He's not one to hold grudges, or at least he's not one to think that you should hold grudges. If you're someone who's trying to make peace with the world and you're willing to relax a little bit and lower your standards to do it, I would check out Aurelius. Basically, it's just the inner life of a man who is an extremely admirable person and a very accomplished one, but also just very internally damaged in a way that's kind of sweet and really endearing. And he has a lot of life experiences that you can tell he draws from his life experiences and crafting his message, and it's very good. Oh, also, I better say, he had no real intention of publishing this. Because he was the fucking Roman emperor, I assume on some level he understood that people might read this someday, but it really was his private diary. Just the musings of someone dealing with a whole lot of bullshit and, I don't know, trying to keep his eyes on the common good, as he would put it. Okay. What order to do these? Probably the one I read them. The Doors of Perception by Aldous Huxley. This book is fucking notorious because for a lot of people, this was their introduction to the topic of psychedelics. Basically, this was almost the trumpet call announcing their entrance in a major way into Western culture in the 50s. I've actually learned recently that the impetus for this book is that there were researchers and promoters of psychedelics who found the experiences fascinating and were deeply frustrated at how hard it was to convey the experience to other people. It was just ineffable. It was very hard to put into words. And their way of solving this, at least according to Alan Watts, who I got this story from, is they just went to Aldous Huxley, who was an incredibly exploratory person, insanely open-minded, insanely creative, had an incredible imagination and ability to see possibilities in unlikely places. And the thinking was, oh, Huxley is a fucking genius. He can explain anything to anyone. So if we give him the drug, he'll have the experience and use his master wordsmanship to tell it to the masses. And that's kind of what he fucking did. This book is very short. If you keep up a brisk pace, you can read it in an afternoon. Not hard at all. This book really serves two purposes. The first is it's just a recounting of a mescaline experience. I had to stop myself because I just realized that not everyone knows what mescaline is. It's the active chemical in peyote and other various related cacti. It is a psychedelic that gives visual hallucinations and just a general altered state of consciousness. I have never taken mescaline, I just kind of know what it does from stories. It is a recounting of that experience and a little bit of philosophy thrown in where Huxley interprets what it means and just kind of shares his perspective on it. It is fascinating. One detail in here that is fucking hilarious is Huxley got trapped for several minutes just staring at folded curtains next to a window or something. And there's a whole passage where he pontificates on how artists constantly draw nudes and still lifes, and this is actually a sleight of hand where what they're really after is they want to draw the drapery. There's a naked lady in the middle of the painting, and that's just to kind of get people in the door. The real meat of what it is the drapes, because there's so much complexity in the fabric just falling over itself that you could stare at it for hours and hours just completely wrapped up in contemplation of what you are visualizing. And the subject is actually an artifice to allow the artist to draw drapes. I am exaggerating slightly by saying that, not all that much. He basically says that like drapes are the greatest thing in the world, and this is why painters paint anything. It's just an excuse to look at drapes. He kind of draws the conclusion that humans have a valve in their mind that controls the amount of information that flows in at any given moment. And he thinks that artists have this valve constantly cracked open slightly, and that's why they're so into visuals, is they're where a normal person's brain immediately processes images as if they are words, basically. Artists always have access to a larger portion of the raw information, and the need to express this is why they are artists. I don't know if I necessarily agree with that, but that's basically it. It's generally just the musings of an insanely intelligent, verbose man tripping some balls and taking the message to the people, and that's what it did. This basically started the little honeymoon period in the 50s where there was a lot of excitement over psychedelics and the fear had not really set in. Then LSD propagated over the 60s, and eventually there was the backlash, and then that dominated the rest of the century. But you get a little insight into a very brief window of time where these drugs were not demonized, and there was kind of a almost childlike enthusiasm for them, which this really captures. Which leads us into Food of the Gods by Terence McKenna. I had barely learned who McKenna was when I got this. I was barely getting into psychedelics as a concept a little bit. I'd seen a few pictures of him on the subreddits. People seemed to really fucking like this guy who were in the psychedelic community, but I didn't know a damn thing about him. And then, basically by coincidence, I maybe mentioned it a while ago, I don't know, but my cousin's boyfriend got me this as a birthday present, and holy shit, this is a necessary book, I've got to tell you. This very much changed my life. Like, this book changed my life so much. I'm not even in the actual stage of life that it began yet, and it already changed my life. This is some good stuff. You have probably heard of the stoned ape hypothesis. This book is one of the primary ways that was propagated out into the world. Basically, Terence McKenna, if you don't know, and why would you? I'm an anime guy. Terence McKenna is an ethnobiologist. He's dead now. His brother, who did a lot of work with him, Dennis McKenna, is still alive. He's done multiple Joe Rogan appearances that are actually really good if you're interested. Terence McKenna was an ethnobiologist. He was a college guy who went around to a bunch of little tribes around the world looking for plants that were used to pursue spiritual experience. Mostly that means psychedelics. He was an expert on shamanism. Him and his brother Dennis were some of the primary people documenting psilocybin, shrooms, the chemical in those. And they actually wrote a book telling people how to grow them. If you have consumed mushrooms at any point in your life, psychedelic mushrooms, very real chance that there is some lineage going back to these guys. They propagated a fuckload of the spores that eventually made the mushroom growing industry, to the extent you can call it that. And Terence McKenna, in this book, he basically delivers a survey of the world psychedelics that have played a role in shamanism and the development of ancient cultures, as well as a certain amount of their role today. And he also gets into the stoned ape hypothesis, where you almost certainly fucking know, but if you don't, his contention in here is that there were ancient proto-humans, they got a hold of psilocybin. At lower doses, it made them better hunters by altering their visual perception. At higher doses, it caused them to develop religious beliefs and develop more complex social relationships because it created group thinking and made people nicer to each other. And this eventually led to the development of modern humans. And the reason that modern humans hate life so much in Terence McKenna's eyes is that we are no longer in connection with the drugs that led to the development of our complex societies, and we are therefore in a state of eternal psychic turmoil because of this. I will say about the stoned ape hypothesis, I have a major problem with it, which is, I think Terence does a fantastic job of explaining how psychedelics could help an ancient tribe to prosper. I think he does an extremely poor job of explaining how that actually altered our genetics. I see the basis for believing that compatibility with psilocybin would be evolutionarily selected for. I don't see how it leads to the increase in human brain size and the development of complex social existence, which is what he actually claims. Beyond that, this book is an extremely great introduction to Terence. I haven't read any of his other books yet, but I've listened to a huge amount of his recorded speeches so far, and know a fair amount of his thinking just through that. True Hallucinations was the other big McKenna book that he wrote with Dennis, and that's probably next on the chopping block. But if you have an interest in psychedelics whatsoever, or just like the stoned ape theory, or have an interest in Terence, this book is amazing. It does a great job of giving you a very brief overview of their role in the societies that we have documented so far. And Terence does go on some tangents that don't necessarily make sense. They're valuable in their own way. And if you know anything about Terence, he goes really, really fucking far with his concept of how the world works and how psychedelics go into here, and how psychedelics play into that. This book does not go 1% into the depths of weirdness that Terence eventually did go to. This book is very approachable in comparison. The self-transforming machine elves have a very light role in this part of Terence's production. If you have any interest in the topic, look at it. Also look into McKenna in general, though I probably don't need to tell you that if you care. And not quite finally. There's another one I'm going to grab too. We have Letter to a Christian Nation. This was interesting because this was almost a weird blast from the past. This book was written after, I want to say it was written right after the attacks on September 11th. Or, I might be fucking it up, but basically this book was written in like the early mid-2000s. It's Sam Harris just kind of telling America, get over it with the religion stuff. Kind of an oversimplification. This book is interesting where it almost feels quaint. It feels like it was written for an era of the religious debate that doesn't really exist anymore, where we've kind of moved on into a whole new stage. There are people who would still look at this and go, oh yeah, that'll fucking show them. Tell them, Sam. But I kind of feel like the moment has passed. Like, at this point, we get it. At least the foundation of the religious argument in this country is pretty well established, to a large extent by people like Sam Harris. For someone like me, this book feels like it's a very elementary, early stage of the process compared to where I currently am. For someone who's younger or just kind of starting to question religion on their own, this is still a fantastic book, and part of what makes it so good is it's very practical. It's not super metaphysical, it doesn't get that much into, proving that God doesn't exist or whatever. A lot of it is just very grounded problems that Harris has with the way things work in this country, which are obviously the result of Christianity and really can't be blamed on anything else. Stuff like, look at how common HPV is among young Christian women raised in conservative households. This is an obvious fucking problem that we shouldn't have to deal with, and your refusal to see reason is why we deal with it. Stuff like that. It's not him being bitchy for the most part. It's him pointing out things that really no one would argue with unless you had a very strong religious reason to do so. It's fairly grounded, and even if you were sympathetic to Christianity, which I kind of am at this point, it's very hard to look at this book as unfair. It's almost like a list of grievances where any reasonable person could expect the people being talked to come up with some kind of response or explain themselves. So, very simple overall, not a long book, kind of like Doors of Perception. You can read it in an afternoon. I'm pretty sure I actually did. But it's good for what it is. Kind of something I've moved past, but it's still a valuable text. For a point of comparison, I just listened to Sam Harris, his fucking recording of him doing the heroic dose of psilocybin, and I put him right on top of food. That's kind of fun. And, that's where it is. It's like, both Harris and I are pretty fucking far we're pretty far past the point and the context where something like this was directly relevant, and it's still valuable, but almost as something to look back on. Unless, like I said, you're just much younger than I am and kind of need to be brought up to speed. One sec, I'll be right back. And might as well throw out there the one that I'm currently allegedly reading, Breaking the Spell by Dan Dennett. This book, I'm not a big fan of it. It's kind of frustrating where it's the same thing as Letter to a Christian Nation, where Dennett is writing for an audience that kind of doesn't exist anymore, and Dennett himself isn't really active in the same way anymore. He might actually be dead, I didn't check. He was pretty fucking old in the 2000s when he was active. I would call this book deeply frustrating, where it has a lot of the same problems as Letter to a Christian Nation, but just without the charm, it doesn't, and it's not something that lasts in the same way that book does. Where this is Dennett talking about religion, he tries to construe religion as a natural phenomenon, says right on that little stripe there. It's him both complaining about religion and kind of poking holes in the criticisms people throw up as to why it shouldn't be challenged. Again, the main problem with this is, from my perspective, this just feels like child's play. Like, this was written for a context where it was much more taboo to criticize religion. Prominent figures who criticize religion constantly weren't as big back then. There was really just Carlin, Bill Maher, people like that. It wasn't something that you would find in the local bookstore so much. At the time, there was a real novelty to this, but that time has passed, and it almost feels like if you need to be told this, you're a fucking dumbass, and it's not even worth the energy it takes to bring you up to speed. Again, if you're 17 and watching this for some reason, that doesn't apply to you, but for me, it almost feels like Dennett's just whining or making points that are fucking obvious. There's a lot of preaching to the choir in this book. I would say. It's just kind of frustrating. I'm going to open this real quick. Just to look at a few of the things. Part 1, opening Pandora's box. Breaking witch spell. Then he has we're making a definition of religion. Can science study religion? Should science study religion? He draws an analogy to music. Why good things happen. Then he gets into the evolution of religion. There are places where this is actually valuable. He brings in some evolutionary theory that could actually contribute to something meaningful. But so much of this is just him attacking people. Not in a mean way, but he's addressing... Much of this book is him addressing people and criticisms where no one who would ever fucking make them is someone that I would take seriously or give a fuck about. Basically, if you actually need this book and the criticisms Dennett is throwing out are relevant to you, you're so far removed from any real discussion that can be had on this topic that it doesn't matter. He's kind of kicking the shit out of people who wouldn't be able to even ask these questions in a way that's unhelpful, and I don't care. There are people in the world who believe in religion in a certain type of way where this would be relevant to them. But I don't give a fuck about those people. They have nothing to do with anything I would ever talk about. It's I'm not going to... Whereas Letter to a Christian Nation is something that... Those criticisms, you would have to take them seriously. If Harris went into a fucking church and said to people, you are causing the spread of an infectious disease because you are refusing to immunize, society needs to hold you to account on this, you need to fucking explain yourself. That is completely legitimate. That's very fair of him to do in basically any circumstance. This is going into a church and being why won't you let us question that God exists? Fuck you. And he's not that mean about it, but it's unhelpful. And it's something that you can feel yourself outgrow the argument as it's playing out. And I just feel like any meaningful discussion about this topic is so above much of what Dennett says in here that there's just almost no point to it. And not everyone would agree with me on that, but that's basically the case. Oh, I will throw out... I also did go through Drawing on the Right Side of the Brain. Again, it's a good book, just not what I was into. And that is Catcher in the Rye. I have tried to read that book 85 times in the last 7 years. It never takes. Maybe it makes me a bad person. I just don't know. And we will get to these. I have a plan for these. That will be another video at some point. But yep, these are all the books that I've been reading relatively recently. There you go. Midori Days for life.